Thank you, Vasavi and Professor Sundar Sarkai for initiating this series of lectures. And thank you all for joining in this course. I also hope to listen to many of you and to learn. Basically, a quick introduction, and what I will do today is very briefly talk about the work we are doing, especially the integrated knowledge program or Samagra Kalike Karyakrama, which we've been running for the past 12 years in Chamarajanagar, which is about 70 kilometers from Mysore and is in Karnataka. Primarily for rural youth. I'll speak about that, lessons that we have learned from this course, not so much as flagging it as a successful endeavor, but I will also try to answer some of the questions that Sundar has raised and contextualize our work and also engage with some of the challenges that Professor Devi has raised. And once again, thank you very much for initiating this discussion. We began this course in 2012. Punarchith itself is very small. It's a collective. We don't like to say we are an NGO because some of us who had like-minded interests came together to form this small group to work on alternative learning. And it drew primarily on the observations we had, my work, which was on the agrarian distress under promoting education. We saw the very negative impact that the mainstream education system had both on youth and on the larger society itself. So it was in that context of trying to bring together agrarian issues and alternative education systems that we initiated. In that context, the question that we tried even before we started the course was the question that Sundar has raised is, what is the challenges faced by fragile communities or disadvantaged communities? Professor Devi has elaborated this very well for the Adivasis, especially the very identity question of Adivasis. But in our context, because we work in a rural, very caste-based agrarian context, I think pertinent for us is the status of rural India and agrarian India. What is happening? And very clearly, this past 3 decades have been a time of great disembedding of the rural economy, the rise of the globalized urban economy, which is has creation of the rural into the urban resources of labor, even the capital that is generated by the rural areas. So it's in that context of the great disembedding, we also see tremendous de-agrarianization taking place. That is, policies that are anti-agriculture, regards, especially for the landless and the small and middle class farmers. In that context, we also see the negative impact of the mass education system, mass elementary education right up to high school, and even although we say only 20% go up to high school or to post-school education, it still has had a very negative impact. And therefore, what has poor quality mass education done to rural youth was something that we looked at. And of course, the intrusion, the spread of mass media, where now, social media and cheap technologies have again enveloped large masses of people, and the negative impact in terms of promoting consumerism and commoditization over
Dr.
that of
Vasavi, sorry for the interruption. I think there might be an issue with the audio. Your audio is breaking. So could you turn off the video and try? Maybe that will solve the bandwidth issue.
Yeah, okay. Can I continue? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Is that better?
I think we'll be able to tell in 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So it's in the context of the erosion of local knowledge systems, especially knowledge related to 3 domains, which is agriculture, but also that of ecology, architecture or house construction, and very importantly, food cultures, which have had changes in food cultures, which have had negative impacts on nutrition, which relates to this conundrum that India has, that we've had increasing in food production, but also increases in malnutrition and especially not only in Adivasi belts, but also in the rural areas itself. So it's in that context of this erosion of knowledge, and therefore the challenge that we had is how then, in a context of providing alternative education or learning systems, what is the knowledge systems that we should uphold, what is the new ones that we should integrate, etc. So in understanding the knowledge forms, when we looked at the rural societies, what we found was that caste-based societies, knowledge was transferred, and this is kind of well dominated, is primarily caste-based. And therefore it is linked to socialization, identity formation of youth or young people. But in a context of disembedding, there is a disruption. So older generations are not transmitting earlier knowledge systems to the younger people at all. So knowledge about agriculture, processes, seed conservation, identification of plants, identification of herbs, using all this for medical purposes, for healing, for nutrition, etc. is very, very poor now. Constructing appropriate houses using local materials, there is absolutely no knowledge of this. They're now all mainstream into concrete. There is a concretization. And thirdly, food cultures is not only using growing local food, herbs, vegetables, fruits, etc., but processing them, conserving them as seeds, and using them for particular purposes also has also been lost. So it's in that context we found that while this has decreased very sharply among Hindus, in addition to this, there is also a strong, what we call anti-labor, anti-manual work attitude, where there is, again, it's very caste-related, not only Sanskritization, where, you know, and it's the impact of the mainstream education, where those who are literate, educated, would seek only formal jobs that alienate them or distance them from manual labor. And we see this particularly among girls who are educated, who now disdain even, you know, processing food, etc. Most girls now, which accounts for declining female labor ratio across rural India, are withheld from doing agricultural work because it's a matter of shame to have educated girls work in the fields, etc. And we see that in the extent to which there is loss among girls of both skills and knowledge related to agriculture and to processing at the households. If this is primarily relevant for large numbers of caste groups across the spectrum, from upper caste, middle caste to even low rank Dalit caste groups, we see that it's a little bit better among Muslims. And I think this is very important to document in the context of rural India, where we see where Muslim groups and families don't have that much of disdain for manual labor, unlike Hindus. Therefore, Muslim children, we found when we interviewed youth, you know, say between 12 and 13-year-old kids who would even drop out, we found that Muslim boys are actually able to get employment, to make have jobs and sustain themselves better than Hindu youth, mostly because they would not hesitate to do smithy, carpentry, work in garages, any kinds of manual work which they did at home, and also the kind of jobs that they would generate as independent workers, etc. So very big difference between Hindus and Muslims that we documented. So apart from this, if that was the question of what is the knowledge kind of forms, we found that there is a need to integrate, retrieve and revive many of the local knowledge systems which were and as Professor Devi has very well elaborated, have great value and which are being eroded. But at the same time, there are new kinds of challenges that are arisen, and therefore we also need to integrate it with new knowledges. So it is in that context that when we initiated the integrated learning program, the framework that we used and the byline was enhancing individual capabilities, but also promoting collective responsibilities. So constantly we stress this: individual capabilities, collective responsibilities, because we found that is what the mainstream system had eroded. A sense of self-worth for every individual, a sense of, you know, personal capabilities that they could make their lives, they could get occupations and livelihoods, but also being responsible for their communities, to addressing larger public goods of collective issues, etc. The third that we looked at was we have to understand in whatever knowledge modules that we do, help understand macro political economic forces, what is the kind of economies, what is the kind of democracy we have, what is the systems. But at the meso level, the immediate socio-cultural structures, the caste system in the village, the caste dynamics, the religious dynamics, the communalism that is taking place, etc. So socio-cultural structures. But at a more individual level, personal level, at the level of the personhood of every learner, we looked at what are called subjective feelings. What did they feel? How did, the Dalits experience discrimination? How did girls feel when they discriminated in the houses? What happens to working class youth when they travel publicly? How are they treated? Their own experiences of discrimination and humiliation, or lost opportunities, etc. So in integrating this larger framework, the 5 modules we have are first in individual capabilities, done through drama, theatre. For example, when they graduate at the end of 6 months course, they actually develop a play and then present the play. That is their final day in which they get the certificates, etc. But through that, songs, learning to speak, making presentations in individually, all of which the mainstream education system does not provide. Here we also reiterate that this course does not have pass and fail. It is not textbook based, and it has no examinations. Rather, we have error analysis, and we make corrections until they actually get, for example, writing sentences, making presentations, etc. Correctly. So individual capabilities, or the first module. Second is we look at ecology in agriculture, introducing sustainable organic agriculture, looking at soil, water, seeds, multi-crop cultivation, especially cultivation that is rain-fed, rain-dependent, as we are in a dry track, etc. Processing of foods, all of which I'll link to this. Third is active citizenship, encouraging people, especially because we found youth are alienated from the panchayat system, very alienated and distant from democratic processes, why they have to take part in the elections, understand what the election's about, but also becoming, holding local leaders accountable to them, and looking at their rights, looking at programs in which they can access resources, etc. The fourth was understanding, has been understanding social issues, not only caste, but class, gender, religion, and some of the other public events, understanding things as they are reported in the mainstream media, or as events erupt around them. Finally, we have general skills, which is also linked to the question that's on the raise. What is it from the mainstream education system that we need to integrate, which is English, computers, and accounts. While English and computers are seen as just inevitable, and there's a big demand for that, we introduce accounting in very simple ways, because we found a lot of youth are indebted. They don't know how to calculate interest rates. For example, many borrow money. They take what are called EMIs to buy even their mobile phones, etc., but don't know how to calculate interest. Indebtedness is a major problem, and therefore, how do you not only keep accounts, but calculate things like interest rates? So some very, very basic skills which we introduce. If these have been what we do, we've also, as modules, we've paid a lot of attention to pedagogies. We found that it would be futile to introduce these courses using just the lecture and teach methods, or with a little bit of audio visuals, etc. Instead, every module, every interaction had to be made into not only interactive but activity based. Therefore, for example, when we teach the caste system, it's not only explaining the caste, but there are games in which we try to show how being born into a certain caste is really just a lottery. We have a game in which cards are distributed, people selected, and when they look, they play the whole game, the whole caste hierarchy is formed literally, physically, and each of them is able to look at, reflect on the situation in the caste. We give them all the life chance cards which they play against each other. It shows very clearly how caste-based systems define both, economic capital and social cultural capital. Therefore, it accounts for this tremendous hierarchy and tremendous sense of differentiation we have in society, and many are better able to understand that. We also have a lot of gender games that explain gender, religion, but also a whole lot of issues like leadership, team building, exercises which enable learning to be both reflexive and relational. Relational in terms of how different castes, different classes, different genders are positioned against each other, and therefore it accounts for them to better understand society. They're both immediate community, but also the larger society. We also try to emphasize through pedagogies the need for learning to be experiential, for example, to write about it and to analyze it with the group. We also found that just the sessions limited only to the classes auto interactions were very inadequate. For the core, for example, we are handholding them for even 3 years right now, meeting them occasionally, visiting them at their homes, checking on them as to what has happened in their lives, sometimes supporting them in their moments of crisis, etc. So overall, humility that I cannot report success. Over 8 batches and of having trained or had 128 learners, I can say that only about 12 learners are deeply engaged with this even now, and we feel that it has made some kind of impact. Caste and households with very little resources, most of them come from laboring castes and laboring families in which they have to go out and work. Getting income to make their everyday lives itself is a huge challenge. We find that internalizing
I think
to
there is an
implement
issue
sustainable
with audio again. I think it might be a bandwidth issue. Is there anything that you can, any processes running in the background perhaps that is taking up bandwidth? Because it was okay until just a minute ago.
I see. Okay, I'm just checking the connectivity. Yeah, sure. Sorry, it's very cloudy here, and therefore the connectivity is very poor.
Yeah, I think maybe then we can
Now,
proceed. And
yeah.
yeah, the audio when it comes through is very clear. It just has these weird sort of pauses and then it speeds up. It's clearly a connectivity issue. I think we can, I think anything that people miss, they can note down in the chat and we'll come back to that perhaps so that Dr. Vasavi's lecture is not interrupted anymore. You can go ahead, Dr. Vasavi.
Okay. So that has been the lesson for us and the need to constantly tweak this program. So if this has been the thing, I'd like to respond to some of the questions more pointed questions that Sundar has raised and which have been very relevant is that, therefore, what is the kind of framework that is required for understanding or even evaluating these alternative learning systems? We found, at least I think, that framework means very specifically that we factor in both the macro structures, which I mentioned earlier, but also bring it down to the very, very individual level so that both scaffolding individual capabilities, but also preparing individuals for the larger system is very important. And therefore, our modules have to address these questions. Emphasizing collective responsibilities in a growing context where commercialization, focus on occupations means disengagement of the individual from both the community and the larger society, means returning them in ways to address those issues, making sure that it is the greater common good that can only provide them a better environment, better abilities, and therefore how should they prepare, what kind of contribution should they make is something that's both a challenge, but keeping these issues in the framework of assessing alternative learning systems is very important. I also find that when we look at our own systems, because I have not evaluated any other program, but in doing in critical internal evaluation, I found that we need to look at then through our modules, through the pedagogies, and through the content that we have, how are key categories of knowledge disseminated, or how are these issues, categories engaged with the learners? For example, what is knowledge itself? In this context of the erosion of the local, how do we valorize it? How do we show that earlier forms, many of the traditional local forms of agriculture were good, they were sustainable, they may have been low productive, but sustained local biodiversity, they were resilient to sharp variations in climate, they actually produced good food, etc. So therefore, in that category of knowledge, how are issues disseminated is something that we know later. We need to look at the category of power. To understand power has not just those who are elected or those who have big powerful positions, but has all of us being embedded in cultures and structures of power, even within the household, within the small local community, or even outside. And therefore, how should youth negotiate this? We looked at understanding cultures, that there are different types of cultures, appreciating our plurality, diversity. We found this very, very important in the context of growing not only just authoritarianism, but the kind of fundamentalism, the promotion of singular religions and identities, to celebrate not only the unique diversity that we have, but also for people to recognize their own diversities as something that is very positive, and to respect other diversities is also important. So therefore, culture has a category. The category of democracy, which we found in most cases, even those who had gone to college, we find people define democracy as this very simplistic slogan of by the people, of the people, for the people, apart from which they don't have a sense of the history of democracy, of the challenges, of the extent to which democracy, as we have it world over, at least as in its positive aspects, has been made by social movements, by people contributing to the idea of democracy, by holding the state and elected representatives accountable, by questioning authoritarianism, by the whole regime of rights that has risen, etc. So we find, and especially for the past 2 years, where we and the larger network has been very active on issues of democracy and in electoral politics, we found that unpacking democracy as a process, as a culture itself, has been very central to this alternative learning. Finally, understanding issues about tradition. How do you understand tradition? What is positive? What is negative? Which are customary practices which should be rejected? Which are good and therefore through media? But modernity is a set of ideas, a set of values about recognition of all peoples, of rights, etc. This we found has been of great value to the youth, especially as they've gone on to lead their own lives. Within that context, we've also has the parameter for assessing the alternative learning program is to check and to ask ourselves, what are the endowments? If people have gone through this course, what do they come out with? And we asked, which we at least evaluate ourselves with, is the individual learner able to, has this course enabled her or him to have self-worth, to recognize their self-worth? From contexts of great discrimination, hesitation, of not just shyness, but diffidence which they come with, are they then able to recognize? For example, one of the things we tell them that poverty is really, being poor is not a bad word. You should be proud to say your families come from working class families, to say, yes, my father is a coolie, my mother is a coolie, we don't have land, to say that we make our living by our sweat, by our labor, is something that you should be very proud of. And we found that this has really helped a lot of youth who later come and tell us, we now are very proud not only of our grandparents, but our parents, but our community, because we live by our labor. We are not expropriating other people's labor or money. We are not exploitative, etc. So therefore, in second, through the drama, theatre, which we look at enhancing their voice, are they able to speak up? Are they able to stand up for themselves? We've had several examples in which, to our pleasant surprise, some of the most hesitant, diffident youth have stood up against systems. For example, when the demonetization took place and there was really, taking of money, people would take their notes and say, oh, we don't have change, etc. But the youth stood up and said, we won't go until you give us our current, the right amount of change back. In context where Hindu girls have stood up for Muslim girls and fought against certain kinds of oppressions that they were facing. Girls who in their families have stood up on arranged marriages to alcoholic boys, knowing that they have a history of alcohol, but saying, no, I will not get married to a boy who drinks, etc. So just standing up for themselves, that has been one of the most heartening things. A sense of agency, that they can act not only for themselves, but also for others around themselves. Our learners taking up for their younger siblings to make sure girls are not dropped out from schools, standing up for, widowed mothers whose names have, they could get the land registered in their names, etc. So the sense of agency to deal with bureaucracy or with powers, that do you attend the Gram Sabha? Do you go Your documents are in the overall framework in which we assess our learning program, and I think others can also be assessed, is learners as a cohort experience. Include by the three key questions that Sundar has raised. What is the vision for the future? Then the moral stance. To say that the vision for the future must be a hierarchical education system that differentiates and endows unequal education, especially to the disadvantaged. That unless at the foundational level there is equal and high quality learning and education for all, it would be futile to look at others at the school level and at the higher levels to say that we need systems that address both not only community needs but also individual aspirations. It does not mean that the average Adivasi child or youth should not aspire to have a formal career as a doctor, engineer, administrator, etc., but also making sure that others get the opportunities to be in their local areas with local knowledge systems and to have engaged, fruitful lives. In a context, then, I think defining idea of such an education system is the opportunity, equal opportunity for being, for realizing their abilities and their interests. And in that context, we must contest the growing privatization of both education and health to see that these two systems are really two public goods. Access to resources, to good health, to good education has central to all these endeavors. What is the moral stance? That is one of the questions that Sundar has posed, that we as stakeholders should take in these alternative education systems. And I think this is very important because very often we are not critically reflexive about what we are doing. And this, I think, is the biggest challenge, at least some of us have faced, is the need to be absolutely equal in the context in which this learning takes place, but also in our own lives, to not to be hierarchical at all, to ensure the dignity of every individual, every learner, his or her parent, their families that come, to uphold not only their dignity, but also their rights. And in many ways, for some of us as outsiders who come into these domains, to question our own knowledge, not only systems, but to question our own privileges that we have. So with this, I'd like to conclude by saying that in engaging with alternative learning systems and to enhance local knowledges, to enhance what that big challenge that Professor Devi highlighted so well, that indigenous and some local knowledges to be brought together again with the fusion of new knowledge systems where they are relevant, would mean that we should no longer see learning endeavors systems as independent uh, of our assertions for alternative systems itself. It would be futile to talk about these alternative learning systems, knowledge systems that would go back and feed into existing dominant systems. So if we are looking for alternative political economies, for new kinds of economies, new kind of social systems and public institutions, and I think the onus is on us to also work towards that, to see how, even if it is in very small ways, that those alternative systems also emerge, and our learners and we should be engaged with that. Finally, I want to say that in returning to this challenge of combining macro political economic factors with meso cultural individual, we must see that to bring all this together, only a community of this epistemic community of engaged practitioners, only if we join hands, if we come together on a platform, share ideas and support each other, only in a context where I think world over we are facing three big emergencies. The emergency of great economic inequality that is largely accounts for the rise of the authoritarian systems, again, which feeds into the emergency of declining democracy further. And thirdly, climate change, which is then telling us that the existing dominant political economic systems are deeply at fault, and therefore new systems have to be put in place. It's in the context of that and the need for us to recognize that knowledge systems, multiple knowledge systems, and retrieving those would be central to the future that we should all have collectively. Thank you very much, all of you, and I'd be happy to take questions later. Thank you.